you all for showing up. This is a topic that really very few people besides myself do. I'm not looking at religion, what religion has to say about nature, which is where most people's attention is attracted, but rather a more subtle kind of influence. And, excuse me. I'm going to be talking about the United States. I don't know that everybody necessarily is familiar with American environmental history, so I'll just give a really brief summary of its major eras. It began in what we think of as environmentalism or conservation. It begins in the late 19th century with the establishment of the world's first national park, as well as the first city parks in the United States, and the states also began to establish parks. So that begins in this period, and also we begin to hear the first demands for conservation and for forestry, as the American environment was completely open and unregulated, and American forests were disappearing at an astonishingly quick pace. Then we reach a sort of classic era of conservation in what in American history is known as the Progressive Era, which is roughly from 1889 to 1920. And here we begin to see the movement for parks and conservation and forestry emerge at the national level as a national force with the national government. And although, of course, we had a national park in 1872, there was no national park system. It was a very haphazard, the park system grew very haphazardly, but the National Park Service would be founded, the National Forest Service would be founded in this era. And so it becomes very important at the national level rather than just local and state level. Then we have what we think of as the environmental era of American history, the classic era, which would be beginning after World War II and lasting up until really the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, when it comes to a rather its political influence comes to a rather quick end. This is when the emphasis shifts from just parks and forests to worrying about the toxic waste and toxic chemicals in the environment and too many pesticides and clean water, the endangered species. All of these sorts of concerns dominate this period more than just parks. And then there's a period that I call post-environmentalism, 1980 to present, mainly because this is the era of a strong anti-environmentalist movement, a reaction to environmentalism, funded mostly by corporations and wealthy people. But also and you have these more popular movements in environmental history that operate much more at the local or the individual level. For example, organic food, the eco-justice movement, environmental radicalism like Earth First, people who chain themselves to trees to prevent development, that sort of thing, is a reaction to like this mood of anti-environmentalism. And it's also the decline of the mainstream environmental movement in American history. And we see no major national legislation, environmental legislation in the United States since 1990. It's just sort of, at the national level, it's kind of died. So this is, what I see as a trajectory of American environmental, the history of American environmentalism, what you would call green movement in Europe. Now the question is, okay, what does religion have to do with that? So what I did, I got interested in not the adult religious beliefs of people who were prominent in the environmental history, but rather what was their religious upbringing. I got interested in this from looking at John Muir, famous figure in American environmental history, who had a really religious upbringing, but was not, was religious, but in a kind of more spiritual way, never went to church as an adult. And so traditionally it's been looked upon as he rejected his upbringing. But if you have been raised religious, like I was raised in a religious household, you know that this stays with you. There's much of it that never goes away. You do not, there's this, a person's life does not have this kind of moment where you reject everything that came before. There's many, many continuities. I became interested in the continuity. So, looking at the religious upbringing of people, I noticed in 19th century conservation, the early period, practically every single person was no further away than one generation from a congregational church, and particularly those that were concentrated in the Connecticut River Valley. This is a really small region of the United States, and yet person after person after person came out of that region. So there's something special about the congregational church in that region, clearly. There's something going on. And then looking at the progressive era, the Congregationalists disappeared. They're not active at the national level. And instead what we see are Presbyterians. I will be explaining about who Congregationalists and Presbyterians are. You don't have them probably in Finland, but very important in American history. So why is it there's a shift, and what does it mean? And then looking again at the environmental era, again, person after person, is just an astonishing number of people who were raised in the Presbyterian church, but were not Presbyterians by and large as adults. So, in post-environmentalism, suddenly the Presbyterians disappear, and we find much more prominently, and this is also true in American progressive politics, that the Protestants sort of vanish, and suddenly we see lots of Catholic leaders, Jewish leaders, and African American Baptists, much more than other, like Methodists or other prominent African American churches. This is also true in the American environmental movement. But I have two questions out of this. Why are the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians so interested in nature and the environment? First question. What's attracting them to this? And then, how has the American environmental movement been affected by the fact that so many people from the same backgrounds are leading the movement? So, first of all, let's look at, I want to point out that the proportion of Congregationalists and Presbyterians in the United States has never been a large number. In 1908, a century ago, when they were at the peak of their influence, you can see Presbyterians were no more than about 8% of the population, and the Congregationalists were even smaller. And today, both of these denominations are vanishingly small. They have not only been losing proportionally in membership, but they're losing absolute numbers since the 1960s. So if nothing happens, they probably will disappear in 50 years. They won't no longer be there. Notice the interesting, you can see the incredible diversity of American religious scenes. And just because you're Baptist doesn't mean you belong to the same Baptist church. There are lots and lots of different Baptist churches that and disciples different streams that belong to different organizations. Okay, who are the Congregationalists? Let's start with them. Congregationalists are the Puritans. The Puritans who came over to America, colonial America, mainly after the 1630s. was a major wave of, say, 20,000 Puritans fleeing from England and establishing these colonies. This is what's known as New England. I don't know if you know the various regions of the United States, but New York City would be here, and it's sort of the America, the United States, east of the Hudson is known as New England. And this map shows the density of population by 1750. You can see it's mostly coastal. Boston is here. Massachusetts would be there. Rhode Island. and then Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, and Vermont is up here, and this here is the Connecticut River, and it's this region that is the source of so many Congregationalists in the 19th century. What they are about is Puritans are Calvinists, coming from the Calvinist tradition. The Calvinist tradition is a very sort of totalist kind of ideology, religious ideology. Everything must be remade according to the biblical model, including not only the church and theology, but also government and family and towns and social relations and culture. Everything must be Bible-based. The Bible must be the basis of everything. So in New England, where they, like nowhere else in the world, they had the opportunity to build a society from the ground up that was completely based on their interpretation of the Bible, everything about it. So it's a thoroughly, today we think of it as an ideologically built society. So in a way, what we're talking about here is that conservation is a cultural production of this set of founding principles. So the Puritans believed that everybody must live in towns, and in this way they are consciously acting in distinction with other English colonies like Virginia, like Barbados, which were completely individualistic, every person on their own piece of land, and they're also incredibly immoral. They're full of drunkenness and vice, and everybody was commenting on what nasty places these were. Puritans had this as a counterexample. The other colonies, we don't want to do this. We want to do this in a much better way. So they believed everyone had to live in a town. Nobody should be living by themselves because God did not want us to be living for ourselves. He puts each of us on this earth to benefit other people, to benefit society. In order to do that, you have to be living in a group, not by yourself on your own piece of land. And also, if you're going to be a godly person, you can't, godly people don't live by themselves because when no one's watching you, you misbehave. It's like, I mean, you could give a current example. Do you go to websites that you would not go to if your mother was in the room? We behave better when we know somebody's watching us. So Puritans knew this. So the foundational principles of Puritan was first biblical religion, a godly culture, but also they wanted to create an equitable society because they believed that poverty and inequality were the products of sin. So that a society that worked well for everyone would be what God wanted. So they're trying to create a society where everybody's got what they need and there will be no poverty. And of course, each person is taught that they have a moral duty to be productive and beneficial to society. And the community here is put before the self, as I mentioned. This is a map of a typical Puritan town. And a couple things to notice is everybody lives together. These yellow lots are the town, or your house lot, and the little squares are the houses. So people are not scattered out on their own land, but rather they're brought together in community. The meeting house, which functions both as a church and as a town hall or whatever. So there's a unity of democracy and religion in these towns. And the red lots, well, you can see there's also common areas, which is New England is the only place where you have common fields in America. If you look at Virginia or the other colonies, everything's privatized. So there's the idea that some of the land must be for common purposes. But each person also gets their own plot of land, and all these that are marked in red are owned by the same person. And they're not, you don't, like you would in Virginia, buy a single plot of land and that would be your land. The reason that you need this is because of the demands of convertible husbandry, which is that you're going to need hay fields. So there's the great river meadows. So the meadows are perfect for raising hay. They're too wet for crops. And the hay will be harvested at the end of the summer because New England is very cold and there's nothing for the cattle to eat in the wintertime. So you gather the hay to feed the cattle throughout the winter. And then because it's cold and the cattle are not out in the fields, they're in the barn, you can collect their manure. And then in the spring, you will also have a field like, let's say that one up there, where you're going to be, it's arable, and you will raise your wheat. And so you will use the manure to fertilize your arable land. So you're going to need also a woodlot, let's say it's this one, because every home is going to need wood for its fences, for building, for keeping warm in the cold winters. Every home needs wood. So every home needs all of it. You also need pasture land for your animals in the summertime. So there's also going to be pasture. So you have to have a piece of land scattered around the community where you can have all these resources. So not only are we building an equitable society, we have a sustainable society. And this is the only place in the United States that I know of where people founded an equitable, sustainable society. So today we're talking about having a just, equitable, sustainable society. Here is one. I don't know if anybody would want to live in a Puritan community, but maybe that's what is necessary in order to create a equitable, just, sustainable society, is to live in a society where we do not have the freedom that we think we want. Anyway, make a little sermon anyway. Okay. This is a photo of one of these towns that still survives pretty much in the way that it did back when it was founded. This is a photo from the late 19th century, excuse me. And here you see the meeting house in 19th century style. It would have been a much plainer church, plainer building in the colonial era. And then you see the houses spread along the road with their long lots. Everybody notice the lots are very long. That is so that, go back. The lots are really, really long. That's so that no one person is getting all the best land. So if you have the lands in long, long strips, then everybody can get a bit of the same quality land. The purpose of this is to prevent poverty. Every single person gets, when they set up the town, every person got all the different kinds of land that they needed to sustain their families. That didn't mean everybody got the same size of land. Notice that some of the lots are much larger. They did believe that some people were more valuable to society. They were the leaders of society, the magistrates, the minister. These people were worth more to society and therefore deserved to have larger lots. So they don't believe, they're not communists or something, they're socialists, but they believe everybody should have the exact same thing. So anyway, there is the Puritan town. And out of this comes conservation. So the principle, the town of course evolves, but the principles still stay there. Here we have the Congregationalist Church dominating the town in the early 19th century. But you also see this productive landscape, sort of a classical landscape of the American New England town. The inhabitants of the town believe very strongly that what they have, what they own, was God's gifts to them and should be preserved for future generations. So this becomes kind of a guiding principle for the towns, and it's also the same principle behind conservation. We must conserve our resources for future generations. And so we don't see it as, we see it as a secular thing rather than what God has commanded us to do. The town then regarded it as a communal principle that they must regulate what the individual does with their land. Because individuals, because they're Calvinists, they believe we're all sinful I don't know if you know anything about Calvinism. Calvinism believes we are all innately depraved. So you are going to misbehave. They don't trust anybody to behave themselves. And so the town must regulate what you do. They are particularly concerned with timber, because a town with no timber cannot survive. You have to have timber for many, many things, including heat, but also buildings and all these wooden fences. Without timber, the town can't survive. And anybody who would cut all their timber and sell it for immediate profit would be harming future generations. Future people who own that land would not be able to sustain themselves. So they would pass laws preventing you from doing that. Then they would actually, in effect, they would have to pass these laws. You'll see them passing these laws over and over and over again, which tells me that they were often ignored. But they did want to try to prevent it. And every person believed in, there's this 19th or 18th century word improvement. People often see it. It's widely used. The idea of improving your land. This is a key Calvinist concept that God wants us to improve our minds, our souls, and our possessions in order to make ourselves more useful to society. All right, out of this comes conservation, and we can see this in, would everybody know George Perkins Marsh? In here was that? Probably not. I don't know. George Perkins Marsh wrote Man and Nature in 1864, which is looked upon, it was an internationally known book. It's the first book to really codify the idea of conservation and to make an argument from his widespread travels in the Middle East that if humans go into a place, cut down all the trees, and abuse the land, this land will erode and leave it a wasteland. And he could point at many places around the Mediterranean that in Roman documents and ancient Greek documents are described as beautiful, groves and green, and you go there today and it's a bunch of rocks baking in 100-degree sun. It's a desert. And he thought, well, the only reason that it's a desert now and it was a beautiful green place back then was that humans have been there and abused the land. And this is what, if you don't use the land wisely, you'll end up like the deserts of North Africa. So it alarmed lots of people because Americans and Western civilization in general was cutting its trees down really quickly, and the trees are the key to keeping land productive and water flowing. He himself is from Vermont in the Connecticut River Valley and grew up in a very deeply Calvinist congregationalist family. So he's a perfect example of this secularization of religious principles. Because if you read his book, he doesn't talk about God ever. However, there are lots of little sections in there that read like sermon that he could have picked up easily from the pulpit as a boy. But he also believed that as America was growing in the 19th century and moving westward and towns were being founded, that the best way to preserve the land and resources of America was if little New England towns were built all over America. That the New England town was the model for a just, orderly, sustainable society. Unfortunately, this would not happen. But that's what he believed, and he was advocating this. Unfortunately, also, New England farmers, because of the railroad, were now in competition with cheap grain that was coming in from the West and could no longer have any sort of sustainable system in place that would pay off. And so they began to cut down the trees everywhere and create pasture land in order to have dairy cattle to sell the dairy to the industrial cities like Boston and New Haven and Hartford. And so because the economic system was changing, they could no longer behave the way they used to. So Marsh was watching this and saying, this is terrible. we have to act to preserve timber and water for future generations. This is not happening. This is an illustration of how the land is changing rather rapidly. In this time period, we have, because New England was very successful and everybody had large families, the people were pushed into more and more marginal land. And as you see somebody clearing land up on a hilltop, which is not the greatest place for a farm, and setting up this farm. And then by a century later, what the landscape looks like, all the trees are cut down, and everybody is using the land beyond what can get produced. And so by 1850, people are abandoning New England. The farmers are leaving New England and heading west to live on their own little land, plots of land, not in a New England town, and in order to survive. So, Marsh advocates preserving forestry. So Congregationalists as a group begin to promote forestry in 19th century America, and were foremost in creation of a division of forestry in 1881 in the United States government. And it's located, interestingly enough, in the Department of Agriculture. So it shows how they conceived it as part of what farming was about. And a farmer is supposed to be preserving his woodlot. So it's seen still as kind of an individual. If we can promote farmers to preserve their woodlots, then their land will be valuable for future generations. And the Forest Division will evolve into a forest bureau, and finally after 1905 it becomes the United States Forest Service, which it is today. But of the first 6 heads of the Forest Division and the Forest Service, 5 of them are coming out of Connecticut River Valley Congregationalism. So these are the first one, Franklin Huff, Nathaniel Eggleston, Gifford Pinchot is the most famous of them, Henry Bayes and William Greeley. This goes all the way up till the end of this, until 1929 from 1881. So this is a really long run. And in fact, Nathaniel Eggleston was himself a congregational minister, ordained minister. So it's explicitly, there's explicit connections here with this congregation. As for parks, in the early 19th century, the common lands had lost their economic function, and most towns were beginning to beautify them by planting trees and developing them to be a communal resource for everybody, rather than selling them off or something. They continue to own them as a communal resource, and usually the church is right on the park, so there's this central green, as it begins to be called, rather than a common. So the classic New England town of the 19th century is the church on the green. You can find images of this all over Google if you want to. And this is an example of one in New Haven, Connecticut, which has got 3 churches on it. 2, this is the first Congregationalist church, this is the second one. I don't know why they need 2. They have 2 Congregationalist churches, and then the Episcopal church is over here, that's the Anglican church. You can see that also Anglican churches had their own style. New Englanders then began to use this model of the green, the town green, for other cities, saying, you know, your city also could use an open space for the common people, for everybody. It's democratic, so it's for the whole community, including the poor people who can't get out of town to take a vacation in the woods, in the mountains, like the rich people can. And it's also a place where they can get close to God in nature. So it has this kind of moral purpose. And Frederick Law Olmsted, who's also from Hartford, Connecticut, which is in the Connecticut River Valley, and he grew up in a very conservative Congregationalist church, becomes the leading advocate for parks in America in the late 19th century. He gets his start building New York's Central Park, which is the first city to specifically create a park that didn't exist there before for the benefit of the people. And again, it's New Englanders who are pushing for this, who are arguing for this. And there's Central Park, and notice that it has a very naturalistic design. It's not like, it's meant to look like a beautiful natural spot. It didn't look like this before he designed. It's 100% designed. The lakes were not there before. The trees were, it was a wasteland, a rocky wasteland before he came in there, brought in soil and made it look like a beautiful park. So this is Frederick Law Homestead. New Englanders then, parks have this democratic purpose, a social purpose, and a moral purpose. And he is the first person who was called a landscape architect. So it's sort of a founder, in a way, of that field. First landscape architect, got all that, okay. And it's in this time period also that Yosemite Park, which is not a national park because it was given to the state of California to keep as a park, but it's a spectacularly beautiful natural site. And it was thought that it should not be allowed to fall into private hands, which would ruin it and commercialize it, but rather keep it as a resource for the community, for the people. And following that, Yellowstone would be the first national park created in 1872. So, 1858, 1864, 1872, the city, state, and national parks was like created. And again, if you look at people involved here, they again are New Englanders over and over again. Now, suddenly, when the Congregationalists begin to disappear, they kind of peak during the middle of the 19th century, but the reason is that there's a decline of the New England town, which George Perkins Marsh was so worried about. It is no longer a model for people because it no longer is working the way it used to work. And people, fewer and fewer, as these towns decline and become poorer, they produce fewer and fewer social leaders and political leaders. What we see then is instead a series of Presbyterian presidents and Secretary of the Interior, beginning with Benjamin Harrison and John Noble he was president from 1889 to 1893. He is much underappreciated in American environmental history. It really needs to have a good deal more written about him. He and John Noble especially, because under them is the first expansion of the national parks. The creation of Yosemite became a national park rather than a state park in 1890. And Sequoia National Park was also created. And under Harrison and Noble, the Forest Reserve Act was passed, which reserved forests still owned by the government in the public domain from development in order to preserve the forests for their benefits for the people and for protection of water and so on. His successor would be Grover Cleveland, and his Interior Secretary is Hope Smith. Both of them, again, were Presbyterians. And under Grover Cleveland, there are major expansion of forest reserves. He adds another 27 million acres. I have no idea how many hectares that is. I'm sorry. Do you know how to translate acres into hectares?
No, I think 1 acre is 0.4 hectares.
Yeah, divided by 2.5, it's 10 million hectares.
Okay, thank you. You guys do the math. It's a lot of land. And there is then a intervening president who is not Presbyterian, and there's really nothing done in terms of conservation of parks under his administration. He is assassinated in 1901, and his vice president becomes president. His name is, of course, Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt is a hugely active person in environmental history. He adds 5 national parks He creates a new category of federal land preservation called the National Monument, which are in effect, national parks that he can create by presidential decree. And then adds 150 new national forests. So it was really, really important to him. Conservation becomes then, he is really a national movement under him, because he is constantly talking about conservation over and over and over again, creates a governor's conference to advocate conservation. And it is under Theodore Roosevelt that we have the Forest Service created in 1905. And Gifford Pinchot, who I mentioned before, as a descendant of Congregationalists, actually was raised in the Presbyterian Church, so he counts double. He's kind of has both. You can sort of see in his writings a bit of both in what his makeup. Let's see. I want to mention Grover Cleveland has an asterisk by his name, because I'm going to point out how many people here are either descended from or have a minister, a Presbyterian minister who is a close relative, or perhaps they themselves studied to be a minister at some point but never did, and things like that. In other words, they have a really close connection to the Presbyterian Church from the ministerial point of view. It's really surprising how many people this includes. Woodrow Wilson becomes president in 1913, and his Secretary of the Interior, Franklin Lane, was also a Presbyterian. Woodrow Wilson's father was a Presbyterian minister. Woodrow Wilson is not much of a conservationist. Franklin Lane certainly was. And under Franklin Lane, the National Park Service was created in 1916, and then he himself has 8 new national parks. And he died shortly after he left office in 1921, and was cremated and has his ashes dumped off the top of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park, which shows how important that was to him. I also want to mention one other person who is not a political figure, but is absolutely central to advocacy of national parks at this time period, and that is John Muir, who father was a lay minister, not in the Presbyterian Church. They grew up in the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, where he was born, but they sort of continued with a community of Scots in America after they immigrated, but they're not really too officially Presbyterian, but there's a lot of Presbyterian influence on him and on his thinking. He's also one of the founders of the Sierra Club, which is an American, Native American environmental organization. Who are the Presbyterians? Have I run out of time? I'm pretty close to time. This is me with John Knox. Presbyterianism was founded, it's kind of a branch of Puritanism in Scotland, but it has a much more organized church polity. Congregationalist polity is has no real central authority. Presbyterianism definitely does. John Knox, of course, is quite close friends with John Calvin. Presbyterianism emphasizes doctrinal purity and preaching, and this makes Presbyterians rather strict on doctrine, you're either with me or against me, and also, because of their emphasis on preaching, makes them very effective communicators and political figures, because they're sort of evangelists in a way for their cause. And with this, they have this certainty about them, which is often characterized as a quotation from the Bible in the King James Version, "Thus saith the Lord." So the typical Presbyterian preacher would be, "Thus saith the Lord," and then telling you exactly what God wants you to do. It also, Presbyterianism has a really strong strain of natural theology in it, which is the idea of finding the presence of God in nature. Is the best place for a person to find God, get close to God, is to go out to nature where you are amongst God's works. God himself made the mountain, God himself made the trees, and so on. If you're in the city, humans made all of this, and they made it for their own sinful purposes. But to get close to God, you want to go with nature. So there is this strong interest in God's presence in nature, and that through the Enlightenment era grows into a scientific interest in nature, because if you're interested in God's works, you are interested in studying them. So studying God's works in nature is a divine commandment. And eventually you begin to learn about nature, become interested in nature for itself. And so there's a lot of Scots in the early 19th century, which we could name dozens of them, were really important in the development of geology and botany and so on. But they're also very moralistic, incredibly self-righteous, and very censorious. And this is captured very nicely in this 19th century picture, a drawing of John Knox, who is, has got his finger, shaking his finger at the ladies of the court. This is the sort of, it points out these, this desire to preach to other people's sins, but it also points out the fact that, that point, that it is very political, that the Presbyterians want to influence government, national government, in order to create this more godly society. So it is also, Presbyterians are highly suspicious of greed and avarice as not only sinful, but dangerous to the community. And so if you look at the writings of John Muir, one of the things that he's constantly doing is pointing out the dangers of commercialism, of corporations, of the rich, who are just greedy and in it for themselves and trying to destroy these beautiful places created by God. So that's, you can see this strain in American environmentalism. It's really strong. So here we have a picture of Theodore Roosevelt next to John Muir in Yosemite National Park. And when Roosevelt died in 1919, one of the things that many of the people who mourned him said about him was that he had been a preacher of righteousness. And that's, if you look at Roosevelt's career, you can really see this. He's very moralistic, and preacher of righteousness is kind of what describes it very well. And Muir himself is also acts as an evangelist for God's works of nature. So there's this very strong element of Presbyterianism. Now, I don't have time to go through everybody in the 20th century who's important, but let's talk about a few figures. We have Rachel Carson. Her Silent Spring is classic. I'm going to assume it's not a book that's new to you. You've heard of it? It's oftentimes seen as the book that started the American environmental movement in 1962.
It was translated into Finnish already in 1963, and it actually sold pretty well in Finland.
Yeah, it had a big influence in Scandinavia, actually. So, and her grandfather and her uncle were Presbyterian ministers, so that's really important. And let's look at another person, David Brower, who was the executive director of the Sierra Club in the 1950s and 1960s. And the list of the things that he did is just too much to put on a PowerPoint slide. But he was instrumental in the creation of all of these national parks and seashores and so on, preservation of land, campaigning against dams that would be put in the Dinosaur National Monument of the Grand Canyon National Park, and was nominated 3 times for the Peace Prize. And one other person may be sort of surprising to you, would they know after that? He wrote Desert Solitaire. He's, in America, would be really well known as advocate of wilderness against developers. I have him, he has an asterisk by his name because his mother was the organist at her Presbyterian church in Western Pennsylvania. So over and over we have this sort of connection. And here's just a bunch of people that are great examples from American environmental history. You may or may not know them. Americans would probably recognize most of them. And I'm running out of time, so again, notice only asterisks here. Anybody? Holmes Ralston founded environmental ethics, the field of environmental ethics. He is actually himself an ordained Presbyterian minister, and his father and his grandfather were also ordained Presbyterian ministers, so there's a lot of that in him. Ian McCarr is a major figure in modern landscape architecture. His classic book is called Design with Nature. Archie Carr, his father was a Presbyterian minister, was the guy who saved sea turtles in the Caribbean from extinction. Lynn White Jr., probably heard of him. If you know about religion and environment, he wrote a classic essay that blamed Christianity for the environmental crisis back in 1967. And he's got an asterisk because he was an active Presbyterian and his father was a Presbyterian minister. Here's three nature poets, Robinson Jeffers, Robert Frost, W.S. Merwin, who just recently died, I think, this year. Two of them had ministers as fathers. William Douglas, Supreme Court Justice, Harold Nikas, who was Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, very influential, Alice Hamilton, who was one of the founder of industrial medicine, in other words, in the workers working in toxic environments, trying to protect them and so on. Which brings us to the end of American environmentalism, which, again, Presbyterians vanished. After about 1980, there is no major environmental figure in American history who was born after 1945. So the church is changing, it is losing its Calvinism, it is becoming much more moderate and friendly and sweet, and I don't know, I think probably the most famous Presbyterian minister of late 20th century would be Mr. Rogers, the children's, you know Mr. Rogers maybe, and you certainly do. It's like, won't you be my neighbor? This is not the kind of old fire and brimstone kind of Presbyterian minister who it just sort of shows how the church has changed. I mentioned the national legislation. It's just like everything seems to be dying away. We just really don't have those fiery, driven leaders like we used to have 50 years ago. The strongest denominations in the United States these days are the evangelicals and the Pentecostals, and they really have no social ethic to speak of. And there's just not really anything in these churches, the Baptists and Methodists, the Pentecostals, they just do not have this push to find God of nature, the desire to have the government repress greed and avarice, and so on. It doesn't mean that environmentalism is totally dead. There's a lot of personal and private action, but we don't have anything, for example, for global warming, which has really been a significant issue. And that I'm really out of time. So I should have done this. I could talk about, my next section is on France, which, just to show you that it's just not an American thing, it works also in Europe. If you think of European countries, the strongest green movements, the most green nations have consistently been the Protestant, the historically Protestant nations of Europe, like Finland, Sweden, Germany, the Netherlands, much more than Italy or France or Spain or Greece. And I could go into that. The test case would be for France, because France has had Protestants since there were Protestants, but they've been oppressed and they've been a tiny minority, so it's clearly not, it takes a lot of the things out of the historical equation that you might say, was influential in a different country, like, oh, these people are just, they're the elite, or have some sort of social advantage or some other advantage, and this is really what's going on, it has nothing to do with Presbyterianism. Well, if you look in the Protestants in France, then you can, who have had no advantages, this is clearly I'll just skip to a couple maps. Like, picking a map of the vote. The darker green is where the Greens got their strongest vote in France, and you can see certain patterns of regions where this is strong, and it is, interestingly, this is Protestant churches in the 1950s. This is the most recent map I can find. Roughly corresponds. It corresponds even more clearly to where the Reformed churches of the 16th century were. And it's a sort of, although of course in the 16th century Alsace is not part of France, but there is this sort of curve here that's interestingly mirrored in, and also up in near near Flanders, another little small enclave. But it's not an accident. And you could find, let's see, I'm going to skip through what we do not have time to talk about. I have all these wonderful quotations and people, but let's see, modern. Well, of course, Rousseau is from Geneva, pretty good example. I don't know if you know Élisée Reclus. Also Protestant, but for modern French Green Movement, a lot of these major figures, Theodore Monod, again, the asterisk has to do with a close relative being a clergyman, or Robert Renard from Geneva. I don't know if you know French Green Movement, but, or if you read French. I'm sorry if this is Jean Georges from Louis, which wrote a book called Before Nature Dies in 1964, which partly strongly inspired by Silent Spring. He was in fact in contact with Rachel Carson when he was writing it. We have a lot of philosophers. Let's see. Reclus was an anarchist. Personalism, which is a movement, a theological movement in the 1930s, was also extremely influential in the French Green Movement. Nature is to personalism what class consciousness is to socialism, if that makes any sense. It's really the basis from which things spring. Jacques Ellul, don't know, Technological Society. This is the book that inspired the Unabomber, actually. Still continues to be important. It's a fascinating book to read. It's only about that thick. And I imagine it's in Finnish. It must be in Finnish. And then Bernard Champollion, and Denis de Rougemont from Swiss, francophone Swiss, whose The Futures Are Fair. They co-founded Ecologic with John Ellul and Edward Goldsmith in 1945. I'm blanking on what Edward Goldsmith was. What did he write? I'm forgetting. He's an Englishman, influential in the environmental movement of that 1970s period. Politics, we can see, do you know, you probably don't know the French Greens, or do you know Solange is? She helped co-found the first Green Party with Antoine Becter. Ecologic and Sali, in 1973, and co-founded these other Green parties, and Louis Laurent, who was one presidential candidate for the Green Party, still living, was also the founder in 1968 of Friends of the Earth chapter in France. He's a really interesting character. His father was Jewish, but his mother was Scottish, so there's this Presbyterian influence on him, but also he's related through his mother to major Puritans, and also distantly to John Kerry, the presidential candidate in American United States. So they have he's got these interesting familial connections. As a major figure in the history of French Green movement. Today, sadly, he's sort of moved off to the French right, and is kind of a marginal figure today. And more recent people, André Bouchemont from Mulhouse. Mulhouse, of course, is in Alsace. Anyway, and trying to find something more recently, Jan Verling is probably not very well known. But a young and up-and-coming political figure in the Green movement. Let's see, and that is super fast about France, but anyway, I hope to show you that in France we have a outsized proportion of Green leaders from Alsace and from and a lot of the influence on green thinking in France has come from Swiss and from Protestant French, which is really interesting because there are so few of them, but they are really, really important to the French Green movement, which is a really nice example of how Calvinism in particular has influenced the development of Green thought in the West. We could talk more about the influence of Lutheranism on Northern Europe, but I am well out of time. I've touched your patience, perhaps. Thank you very much for coming, and I'd love to hear any questions or comments. Okay.